today I want to talk about which is the more coherent worldview. Is it more coherent to believe that there's a God that exists, or is it more coherent to believe that there's no God?
What's most coherent is to say that there's no credible reason to say that a God does exist. Let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers. BionicDance here. I think the thing that I find most odd about each side of the atheism-theism debate is the standard by which each side judges the accuracy of their position, because that makes a world of difference.
Now, a lot of atheists kind of start with the assumption that, well, there's the physical world, and we can explain everything, say, through science, and there's no reason to posit the existence of a God. Right? You're just adding something that doesn't need to be there.
That's not entirely accurate. What's being added is something you cannot justify. We don't claim to be able to know or prove everything, and maybe there really is a God out there. But we've been given no reason to think so, and being unable to explain something is not a reason. There have been plenty of things throughout history that we couldn't explain at first, and then later we could, through experimentation, with evidence, with facts. Unless you can, the same way, show a God is real, saying one is real is simply an unjustifiable assertion.
So I'm challenging that idea, and I'm saying that the belief in God is the more coherent worldview, and that the atheist actually has two worlds that are very difficult to reconcile, whereas the belief in God is just one coherent worldview.
The problem here, as I'll show, is the basic underlying paradigm that forms this conclusion. He has expectations of how the world is supposed to work and doesn't see how an atheistic worldview can encompass it, not realizing, in fact, that the how it's supposed to work part is different for non-believers.
So, on the one hand, you have this world of causality. We call it, like, the physical world, right? So, science does a really good job of explaining that. Explaining things empirically, you can observe, you can test, and, no need really to posit God other than maybe to create the universe. Some things can't really be explained, but that's kind of built into the scientific methodology. You just say, well, we can't explain that because we just don't have knowledge of all the variables. If we knew all the variables that were the causes of the event, we could have predicted the event, and we can explain it. Okay, so that's fair. But then, is that really our lived experience of the world? Because I take myself to be a person, as I think most people do, and I have an experience of the world. And when I experience the world, it's not just a bunch of molecules bouncing off of each other. I mean, I interact with other people, I interact with animals, I go places, I have beliefs, I have feelings, I have emotions, I have thoughts. I interact with other people and other animals and other beings that also have feelings and thoughts. At least I, assume that they do. And just trying to explain all that in terms of causality, just strictly the causal worldview, I think that there's some problems with that.
Okay, that section was a bit long, and most of us have heard all of it before. But what it boils down to, really, is an argument from incredulity logical fallacy. He says that the science doesn't match his lived experience, and he can't believe that it's all just molecules banging together. But the more we study about the brain, the more we find that that's all that's required for this lived experience. And just because your day doesn't feel like electrochemical brain firing, that doesn't mean that's not what it is.
So, on the one hand, science does a really good job of explaining cause and effect in the physical world. But then we can't get things like values. We can't say, okay, it's wrong to hurt people and it's good to be a benevolent person, someone who cares for others. But you can't get that from science. Science can't, and like this causal worldview, you can't get that there are good things and bad things. You can't get that we ought to be a certain way.
And this is the underlying paradigm problem I was talking about. The basic assumption is about where values come from, and not only that they are valued, but that they should be. and that science can't explain this. But why can't it? I think science explains this perfectly well. Values are a byproduct of survival. The better we treat people, the more cohesive the group, the more likely survival becomes. Values are instinct and don't need an external source, a rule book we must follow. No God required. But this does mean that there is no one universal rule set. We're all on our own, processing these values individually, and not everybody is going to agree on right and wrong. It's one big game of moral improv, which may be scary. You might not like it, but that's a far more coherent explanation for moral behavior than a deity.
Because that's just outside the realm of what science does. It's not in the business of telling us what we ought to do. It just says, well, I can tell you what is based on the framework that we're talking about, based on some starting assumptions. The primary assumption is that everything can be explained through empirical observation.
But that forces us to ask the question, if we don't insist on empirical evidence, on what basis do we claim that something exists outside of our own imagination? How do we test these assertions of existence in order to verify their reality?
So when it comes to whether or not God exists, science doesn't have anything to say of whether or not God exists. It just says, from the beginning, we're just not in the business of dealing with that kind of thing. Our job is to explain the world through purely empirical concepts.
Most of the gods asserted by humanity have allegedly mucked about with the world, causing floods, parting seas, raising people from the dead, giving them magical powers, or even just having chats, which sometimes led them to almost sacrificing their children, but whatever. And yet, once humanity began to be able to record events like these scientifically, or even just visually, these miracles suddenly dry up, which should lead any rational person to think that the main reason such magics were believed was because of an inability to explain them in any other fashion. Either that, or God just doesn't want us to know he's real, preferring faith instead, and so started hiding from us, which kind of makes him a bit of a dick. Really, which seems more rational? Primitive, ignorant humans with imaginations, or a magical sky fairy? Be honest.
We kind of have these two worlds that we live in. We have this world that science does a really great job of explaining, the physical universe, but then we also have this world that kind of starts with a different assumption, the assumption that we have free will. So science basically assumes everything follows causal patterns, essentially that everything's deterministic. And then we have this other view, on the other hand, this other world we live in, that we assume free will, and that everyone has the ability to decide their actions. And then we get things like what we ought to do, and things that are good and bad, right and wrong.
Now we get into that paradigm problem I was talking about. A scientific worldview is specifically about not assuming anything. It's about testing. It's about drawing conclusions from evidence and the results of those tests. If science were able to find reasons to conclude that free will exists, then that would be the assertion instead of pure determinism. The whole idea of science is to make assumptions unnecessary. But if we cannot test something to verify its reality, then it gets discarded until we can. And as yet, there is no reason found to think the universe is anything but deterministic.
If you say, well, really, this world of right and wrong, I can explain it in terms of evolution. It was advantageous to, join in communities for our own safety. And in order to live in these communities, it was better to have this sort of social contract of, not killing each other, not hurting each other, helping each other, and that was evolutionarily advantageous. And so that's how we explain morality in terms of this causal empirical worldview. Okay, that's one way to do it, but essentially what you've said is that all of this free will, all of these right and wrong is just imaginary and they don't exist. That's essentially what you reduced it to. And you basically said, this world that I live in that assumes free will and right and wrong, things like that, and values, that this is really just make-believe, and it, we can perfectly explain it in terms of this causal worldview. But that's not really anyone's experience, I don't think. I don't think anyone says, oh yeah, really, I'm just a bunch of molecules, and this is just sort of a make-believe world.
Well, frankly, what people's experience is and what they think of themselves isn't all that important to reality. People's experience used to be that the sun went around the earth, because that's what they saw. Then we discovered differently. And that's just one example. There are plenty of other experiences that subjectively seemed a certain way until we put them to the test and discovered other things. So again, you might not like being molecules. You might not feel like you're just molecules, but your experience and reality aren't necessarily in alignment.
And really, the scientific worldview, or this, atheist causal framework, is just a way of explaining things.
God forbid, we should ever want to explain anything. You heard it here, folks. Science is just a way of explaining things. That seems like it needs its own t-shirt or bumper sticker, doesn't it? Science, it's just a way of explaining things.
So I'm kind of calling the bluff on the atheists who try to say that worldview is just some minor sort of part of this other worldview.
It's not a bluff. We just haven't allowed subjective experience to get in the way of what has been objectively shown, or to take what hasn't been shown as if it were so. This fellow's emotional perspective is getting in his way. If anybody's bluff is being called here, it's his.
Instead, we start with this view that there exists a God. And God is a being. And he created the universe. So out of himself, basically. God exists, and he creates the universe. So that explains the causal part.
Yet that's pure assumption, pure imagination. If you start with the assumption that there is a God, yet provide no evidence for such a creature, how is that any different than if I said that the universe was created by Zagnar 12, the reality-making robot overlord from the Alterniverse? How is that any less credible? Or any more credible, for that matter? You're demanding belief, or assumption, which is close enough, and not being humble or honest enough to say, I don't know. Because that is what science does. It says, I don't know, followed by, so let's find out. Religion, if anything, stifles the let's find out part, which is the main reason I don't follow one.
And so we have this world that was created and exists according to causal patterns, and then we have this being with a lived experience and free will who instructs us the best way to live, what's good, what's right and wrong, things like that. And so then you have this worldview where really it's coherent.
This sounds like a fan theory, you know the sort, about how Walter White is actually Malcolm from Malcolm in the Middle all grown up, or that the father from Malcolm in the Middle is actually Walter White hiding out from the cops, or that Leia isn't really Luke's twin sister and Yoda and Obi-Wan were lying to him, or some damn thing. He sounds like he's going, no, dude, the universe didn't come from a big bang or nothing. No, there was this magical beardy man who just poofed it into existence and gave us free will and stuff. It totally makes sense. That's what this sounds like.
So you're not having to decide, which one takes precedence? How can I explain one in terms of the other? One's kind of make-believe, and one's really the way things are.
So he's going to believe in God because it's convenient?
So it's more coherent. You're not forced to kind of give up one of the views in favor of the other.
So he's going to keep believing in God because he likes it.
And that also explains things like why there's evil in the world, because if we choose not to follow his instructions and live the way he says is good, then the consequences of our actions, we experience those.
Pretty sure we experience the consequences of our actions, God or no God. But not to deliberately misunderstand him, he's probably talking about justice experienced in the afterlife, where if humans don't get to us, well, God will. Of course, that's basically wishful thinking with no evidence behind it, but what you gonna do?
So basically that's just sort of an intro kind of 101 to why I think belief in God is more coherent than believing God doesn't exist.
And this is me telling you to turn in your teaching license. The basis for your position isn't just shaky, it's not even out of the planning stages. You need to go back to the drawing board and don't return until you've thought this through for reals. Until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please think.
Even YouTubers need Ferraris. Please donate on Patreon.